Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama with me, Frank Pereira, on Rajya Sabha Television. Over the next half an hour, we'll bring you a roundup of all the significant events to have happened around the world this week. But first, a look at the headlines. Amnesty International's latest human rights report points at rampant violations even by global powers in conflict situations around the world. Governments have protected perpetrators in the garb of national security, it says. Cessation of hostilities between multiple warring parties takes effect in Syria, raising hopes for a stalled peace process to begin. Action against operating terror networks to continue. Security versus privacy debate intensifies in the United States, with many Silicon Valley moguls siding with Apple against breaking into a terrorist's iPhone. The issue fuels a wider policy debate on encryption. And Gianni Infantino wins FIFA election to succeed Sepp Blatter as FIFA's president. Infantino assures he will implement wide reforms to restore the body's reputation and standing. Well, let's now take a look at our top focus on the program this week. Amnesty International's latest report on human rights warns that the very existence of protection systems like the UN is under threat, pointing at rampant violations even by global powers and so-called welfare states. It even says governments have gone to extreme measures to protect perpetrators of this violence under the garb of national security. Actual numbers given out tell an ugly story. Here's more.
Just some of the ugly findings of Amnesty International's report for 2015-16. The organization blames it on growing security threats around the world in the last year, calling for urgent and deep corrective measures.
The system to protect human rights is itself under serious threat and needs protection. The system that has been very carefully built over 70 years to protect human rights now needs to be protected from a wholesale attack.
The findings question any search for human welfare, covering just about every region across the globe with some alarming arithmetic. More than 60 million people were displaced from their homes worldwide. Many have been displaced for several years or longer. 30 or more countries illegally forced refugees to return to places where they would be in danger. At least 113 countries arbitrarily restricted freedom of expression and the press. In at least 36 countries, armed groups committed human rights abuses. 61 or more countries locked up prisoners of conscience. 122 or more countries tortured people. War crimes or other violations of the laws of war were carried out in at least 19 countries. At least 55% of countries conducted unfair trials. The existence of the UN and other international bodies intended to protect civilian rights, it says, are under threat, with governments, including those of member states, having gone to extreme measures to avoid holding perpetrators of violence accountable under the garb of geopolitics. There is definite pinpointing of blame too.
And of course, the most sort of brazen example is Syria, where, a 250,000 people have died. Attack on civilians, starting from the Assad regime, now to bombing from Russia, and all of the armed forces as well who are attacking civilians without any kind of accountability.
Damascus's killing of thousands of citizens and starvation caused by blockading international aid tops the list. The report points fingers at Russia on its refusal to acknowledge civilian casualties and moves to block UN Security Council action on Syria. The migrant crisis in Europe out of the Syrian crisis and the inhuman troubles people undergo is pointed out. Hungary, Macedonia, and even Scandinavian countries are criticized for sealing off borders and obstructing regional attempts to help the refugees. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia is highlighted committing war crimes in its bombing campaign. China is accused of stepping up crackdowns on human rights defenders in the name of national security. Russia is blamed for bombing of civilian areas in East Ukraine. The UK comes under fire for its surveillance laws and interception of personal communications, which gained momentum last year. The United States has come in for flag too. Black men who speak out against injustice get shut down all too often, it says. It also pulls up the Indian government for what it calls failing to prevent many incidents of religious violence and condemns growing intolerance in the country. In the prevailing scenario, the report painting a dark picture of global human rights carries a deep importance, calling upon the right people to sit up and pay heed. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, joining me on the show this week to talk about this is Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, editor designate economic and political weekly. I'm sorry about that. So, Mr. Thakurta, so, we all know that human rights violations have been taking place all across the world. But did you think that the problem was this widespread, and the situation is extremely dire at the moment, isn't it?
The situation is actually very, very bad. If you look at it, the United Nations is about 70 years old. If you look at the last 70 years, if you look at the end of the Second World War in 1945, if you look at the turmoil in the Indian subcontinent in that period of time, the mid-40s, never before in the history of humankind have so many people been displaced as at present. They've had to flee their borders. I mean, it's not just the fact that over half of Syria's population has left, but this kind of a human rights violations, we are seeing it across the world in different parts of the world. And I think what has been pointed out in the Amnesty International report is that it's very, very important on the big five with the veto power at the United Nations Security Council to voluntarily restrain themselves for using the veto in situations where you have mass atrocities and crimes that have been, violation of human rights that are taking place in huge numbers. We are seeing it post-Arab Spring. We are seeing it also in the Indian subcontinent. And what the report also points out is that the other new dimension is not just violent armed conflicts which are driving people away from their homes, which are leading to terrible violations of international conventions and laws and principles on human rights. We are seeing huge curbs on the right to free expression, the right to dissent across the world. And we see it within this country and we see it across the world, all in the name of national security. Unfortunately, the situation is not at all good. And where you see in countries where we're going to see a lot of freedom, including in countries in West Asia, countries in Northern Africa. In fact, the situation has really become terrible in these places as governments, as the state machinery is being used more and more to completely violate the basic dignity of large numbers of human beings.
Something needs to be done and needs to be done immediately. But who is that someone or, some body that is actually going to do something about it? Because the Amnesty International report very clearly says that the UN is not doing enough. The Security Council is not doing enough.
At one level, there has to be greater international pressure from international bodies like the Amnesty International. Yes, despite the failure of large numbers of United Nations organizations, we still don't have anything to replace it. I mean, yes, we can. I acknowledge that the United Nations has not been successful in many cases, but do we have a choice? We don't. What happens when these violations take place within nation states, other than international bodies? Then we have regional groupings. All of these need to protect. At the end of the day, greater awareness, including awareness in the media. Okay, you have one Syrian toddler whose drowned body we see, and that results in a public outcry. I mean, there have been hundreds of such incidents. Okay, we need one particular photograph sort of shakes the conscience of the people. Why do we need to have such a situation? I mean, we need greater media coverage. We need greater awareness at different levels. And of course, yes, not just voluntary restraint on the part of the Big Five in the United Security Council. I think we need to democratize the working of the Security Council, and on that there's no Indian will have any doubt. And I think at the end of the day, the whole, what we've seen is that the new media, the use of the internet at one level has improved connectivity, the ability of people to communicate with large numbers of people and also with one another. But simultaneously, we're seeing states clamping down on that right to free expression.
So would you say then it's probably because of the new age media and new media that we're getting to see more and more such instances and we're getting to know about it now?
I'm not so sure about that, because that's only one part of the story. I mean, much of the displacement, much of the human rights violations that we see across the world is on account of brute military force, on account of use of weapons, on account of internal conflicts as well as conflicts among and between nation states. So yes, I'm not saying that isn't a problem. But many of the big displacements of people that you see across the world have really been on account of armed conflicts. And we see that also even within India, the internal security, whether it be left-wing extremists or whether it be the communal tensions that we are seeing.
Do you see anything changing in the near future, or is the status quo going to remain?
I would like to be an optimist. Although I must say that there is very little that's happening across the world which gives reason to be optimistic. There is an international recession that's happening, and during times of recession, these trends tend to get exacerbated. I would like to be proved wrong, but I think at the end of the day, it's each one of us, each individual, each country, each government, and we also need, international, multinational, supranational, as well as these multilateral agencies. We all have to speak up together. If our conscience, we have to wait to see the picture of a toddler, lying on the sea for our conscience to wake. That's bad news. There's terrible things happening across the globe. We have to wake up and be aware of what's happening.
We have to wake up and take note. Thank you so much, Mr. Thakurta, for being with us on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Let's all be optimistic and hope that something changes in the near future. On that note, we'll slip into a short break here, but still to come. US presidential candidate hopeful Donald Trump wins Nevada, and an endorsement from Chris Christie, putting him well in the lead among the Republicans. We'll have that and much more on the other side. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, it remains fingers crossed for cessation of hostilities in Syria that took effect on Saturday, days after the US and Russia agreed on a plan towards taking forward the peace process in the war-racked country. Though there is broad consensus on the need for peace to bring things on track, the truce is temporary and tentative, with each party ready with its insecurities not far below the surface.
Less than 72 hours ahead of scheduled cessation of hostilities, and it is as if there is a desperation to hammer on. Even on Wednesday, opposition and government forces continued to lock horns in Daraya, a Damascus suburb, with Assad's forces claiming that they had captured the southern part of the town. Combatants were required to formally file an agreement to cessation of hostilities by noon on Friday and to halt fighting on Saturday, with the US and Russia, who negotiated a deal early this week, hoping the planned halt will provide a breathing space for stalled Russian peace talks to resume.
If over the next several weeks we can see some lessening of the violence that's been racking that country, then that provides us a basis to build a longer-term ceasefire both in the north and the south, and allows us to move forward on the political transition that ultimately is going to be necessary to bring an end to the civil war in Syria.
The anti-terror war in Syria will continue, however. The US, Russia and other groups agreed on the need to continue targeting Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front. On the face of it, all parties in the complicated Syrian war theatre have come out to say they agree with the US-Russia brokered peace plan. But tensions persist not far below the surface. The Syrian opposition, parties that make up the High Negotiations Committee, says any peace plan ignores the role Assad allies Russia and Iran are playing. Turkey says it fears the ceasefire plan would do little more than benefit Assad. It is also incensed by Russian intervention. The Syrian Kurdish YPG says it reserves the right to respond if attacked. These key players in the peace process continue a slugfest, in much the same way as the talks in Geneva earlier this month collapsed.
The West, the United States, Russia, Iran, the European Union and United Nations have unfortunately not managed to stand tall by the honor of humanity. On the contrary, all these countries, because of their own calculations, have permitted, directly or indirectly, the killing of nearly 500,000 innocent people by the regime and its backers. International efforts to solve the problem in Syria were deliberately derailed or brought to a stalemate.
The UN says the immediate priority is a huge aid effort, essential supplies reaching some 4.5 million people in desperate need of humanitarian help. It carried out its first airdrop in Deir al-Zor on Wednesday, delivering 21 tons of relief material to civilians besieged by the Islamic State.
Protecting civilians and facilitating humanitarian assistance are legal obligations that are incumbent on all parties to the conflict at all times and for all types of assistance. It is a fundamental and irrefutable tenet of international humanitarian law, and it must be respected.
Multiple attacks in Syrian regime strongholds early this week in Homs and Damascus killed 122 people, leaving scores injured. Part of a nightmarish saga that has gone on for nearly 5 years that has killed 250,000 Syrians. Many more than that have fled, creating a refugee crisis rare in human history. Fingers crossed for a cessation of hostilities this time. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Meanwhile, the ongoing migrant crisis in Europe saw fresh tensions this week as European nations stepped up measures to close their borders. More than 1,300 migrants, mostly Afghans and Syrians, have flooded a camp outside Athens in Greece as they were returned from the Macedonia border crossing. They joined the thousands who have arrived in Greece over the last week. Nearly 20,000 migrants are trapped in Greece due to a bottleneck created by border controls as hundreds continue to arrive each day. EU ministers meeting in Brussels this week raised the prospect of a further unilateral tightening of border controls unless there was a sharp drop in the number of migrants arriving from Turkey by the EU-Turkey summit on the 7th of March. More than 100,000 migrants have arrived in Europe in the last 2 months alone. Germany, which earlier supported granting asylum to migrants, this week approved tighter rules with the aim of tightening asylum procedures and return of rejected asylum seekers. Well, here are some other big stories that made headlines across the world this week in our next segment, Globe Watch.
Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump easily won the Nevada Republican caucus, cementing his lead in the race for the party's nomination. The billionaire now has 3 wins in a row after victories in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, who have been trading bobs this week, came second and third respectively. In both the Republican and Democratic camps, a fierce battle is underway ahead of Super Tuesday on the 1st of March, when 11 states go to the polls in perhaps the most consequential voting day of the 2016 primary campaign. Iranians voted on Friday in the first election since a deal with world powers over Iran's nuclear program and the lifting of sanctions. The elections are two-pronged to choose a new parliament and assembly of experts, a clerical body that appoints the supreme leader. Reformists are hoping to increase their influence in both institutions, which have been dominated by conservatives. The outcome could affect reformist President Hassan Rouhani's chances of re-election in 2017. Remote islands of the Fijian Islands in the Pacific struggle to pick up the pieces a week after Cyclone Winston struck the nation, killing 42 people. The Fijian government and international agencies could begin delivering aid nearly 4 days after the cyclone struck. Communication has gradually been restored, even as thousands remain in evacuation centers, their homes destroyed by winds or flooded by the most powerful storm to ever strike a Pacific nation.
Well, moving on to an issue that faces off terror investigations with privacy norms. Tech giant Apple being ordered to unlock one of its iPhones to aid a terror probe, and it's refusing to do so, citing fears of a wider violation of public freedoms. The debate intensified further this week, with many Silicon Valley moguls siding with Apple's stand. And somewhere again, the case influences a broader policy debate on encryption.
It's an old and rapidly mounting global battle between privacy and security. On one side, the terror probe that needs breaking into an iPhone, which may or may not help the case. On the other, Apple's argument that creating the software to unlock an iPhone jeopardizes the security of all iPhones. That privacy, Apple claims, is its biggest USP. Among evidence recovered after the San Bernardino massacre and killing of the killers was an iPhone 5C. The FBI probing the case acquired a court order asking Apple to break into the iPhone belonging to Syed Rizwan Farooq, but Apple boss Tim Cook refuses to play ball. In a letter to Apple employees, Cook wrote, "This case is about much more than a single phone or a single investigation. At stake is the data security of hundreds of millions of law-abiding people and setting a dangerous precedent that threatens everyone's civil liberties." And a lot of the Silicon Valley fraternity backed him too. Twitter's Jack Dorsey, Google's Sundar Pichai, and Facebook chief Mark Zuckerberg.
I don't think requiring backdoors into encryption is either going to be an effective way to increase security, or is really the right thing to do for just the direction that the world is going in. So yeah, we're pretty sympathetic with Tim and Apple on this one.
Apple phone users around the United States are divided on this one, some even within themselves. Should national security get priority? Is this a one-off case, as is being stated, or the route to further privacy violations? Political pressures and a broader policy debate on encryption take center stage.
I think national security should control a bit our privacy, but that I'm with and against, because it's like they are trying to create security for us. They are trying to enhance the security, but then again, sometimes we're not doing anything it's like sometimes you share personal stuff that doesn't link to security. This is invading this privacy is a bit wrong, but I do understand why they are trying to invade our privacy. It's just to ensure our security.
Well, I'm a big fan of Apple. I love Apple products. My daughter used to work for Apple. Big fan, but they need to assist the FBI with national security matters. Definitely believe that. So, Tim Cook, please help the FBI.
On its part, the FBI says the case is not about setting a new legal precedent, but rather about victims and justice and the longer-term perspective of fighting terror. Microsoft founder Bill Gates, who has sided with the FBI on this one, says the case pushes an old debate towards a conclusion.
We've got to refine that balance, because today the situation is unsustainable. And eventually, unfortunately, this country will probably have another terrorist attack. When that happens, and if there had been encrypted data on that phone that could have stopped that attack, the American people are going to say, what happened? And they're going to go to Congress and say, we need a solution. And Congress is going to impose a solution that's going to be bad for technology, bad for privacy, and security will have already suffered.
This particular case has a US jurisdiction, but has major international implications too. A similar battle between the Indian government and BlackBerry some years back says this is not entirely new. For all democratic societies, the trade-off between security and liberty will continue to be a vital one. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, on to some sports news now. Gianni Infantino has succeeded Swiss Sepp Blatter as the president of the World Football's governing body, FIFA. Infantino, with 115 votes, polled 27 votes more than closest rival Sheikh Salman bin Ibrahim Al Khalifa. The other contenders, Prince Ali bin Al Hussein and Jérôme Champagne, were far behind. Infantino had entered the presidential race when it became clear that Michel Platini, boss of European football's governing body UEFA, could not stand. Infantino is a 45-year-old lawyer from Switzerland, less than 6 miles from Sepp Blatter's hometown. Blatter, who had led FIFA since 1998, stood down last year and was later suspended from football for 6 years for breaching ethics guidelines.
I would like also to speak to the stakeholders, to the, of course, national associations that I spoke to today, to the leagues, to the clubs, to the players, and to the fans. And I want to tell to all of you, you will be proud of FIFA, you will be proud of what FIFA will do for football. We enter now into a new era. It was today an important Congress, an extraordinary Congress, where some reforms have been approved, some groundbreaking reforms, and where a president has been elected who certainly can and will implement all these reforms in order to make sure that the image and reputation of FIFA will come back to where they belong.
And finally, after fashion weeks in New York and London, the world's top fashion designers and models, besides buyers and journalists, are in Milan. 6 days of catwalk shows took off on Wednesday, with the biggest brands in the business unveiling their fare. I'll leave you with some glimpses of the event. See you again next time.